Hi there, this is Ian from MPB, and today we have a bit of a treat for you. We have the Nikon Zfc. This is Nikon's latest attempt at making a camera in a vintage style, in a very similar style to 2012's Nikon DF. The main difference is, as you can probably see, aside from the size, is that the Zfc is actually a mirrorless camera as opposed to a DSLR. So obviously the camera is going to be much smaller because obviously it completely lacks a mirror, as you can see in there. So the DF was actually a fairly bulky camera, but it was still kind of based in terms of its styling to Nikon's cameras of the 70s, for example, like the FM2 and the FE2. Now here we actually have my own personal FM3A. So for illustration purposes, you can actually see that with the Zfc, Nikon actually got it really, really close in terms of the overall look of the FM3A. So a few things about the Zfc. It's a crop sensor camera, or aps-c, which means that it's about 1.5 times crop factor. So for example, it would mean that if you were to put a 28mm lens on this, it would be roughly the equivalent of about a 35mm viewing angle on a full frame camera. Next, you'll probably notice that in keeping with the cameras of old, like the FE2, FM2 and FM3A, it actually makes use of a lot of top dials on top of the camera to actually make the shooting experience, I guess, a lot easier, I would say. It means that you have almost dedicated dials for pretty much everything that you would need to change basically whenever you're shooting out in the field. So starting here on the right hand side, you have the exposure compensation dial, which I actually tend to use quite a lot. I actually find that changing this a lot to just tweak your exposures, for example, when you're using aperture priority, is actually a big help. So I tend to use that quite a lot. Next, obviously, you have your shutter button, which is just here. And then you have your main shutter speed dial, which goes from bulb all the way to 1/4000th of a second. And here you can also control what kind of exposure you want to take. So if you want it on bulb, if you want it on timer, for example, it's all controlled on this top dial here. And finally, we have this dial here on the far left of the camera, and it's probably my favorite dial. It's something that I kind of rabbit on about quite a lot in terms of modern cameras, and it's basically a dedicated ISO dial. I love the idea of being able to select ISO very, very quickly as conditions change. It's something that I'm not entirely sure why more manufacturers don't do, but I think it's definitely a welcome addition to this camera. Aside from in keeping with the overall look of the camera, I think it's great to have that dial on top for easy changes. Whilst we're on ISO, this camera will go from the lowest ISO of 100 all the way to 51,200 natively, but it can be pushed to 200,000 if needs be, although I do struggle to find a time when you'd actually need to do that, as I imagine that the results won't be too great, probably quite a lot of mushy shadows and lack of detail. So moving on from the ISO dial, here we also have the MASAP shooting modes as well. You have all the 4 main modes that you find in most cameras, which is great depending on the type of shooting that you're doing and how much time you have or the environment that you're in. So overall, I really love the design of this camera in terms of all the dials that it's provided. And it's almost as if they've basically kept a lot of the DF style buttons and dials and layouts, but obviously made it into a much, much smaller camera. You've probably seen that I failed to mention the resolution of this camera, but this one has 21 megapixels, which I think is a very, very healthy amount of megapixels. Personally, I think for an aps-c size sensor, I don't think you want to compress too many megapixels in there. I find that the more megapixels you do have, the more your image can end up looking a little bit synthetic, shall we say. So I think 21 megapixels for an aps-c sensor is actually bang on the money. In terms of menu systems, those who are used to shooting with a Nikon will actually be really pleased to know that the menus are pretty much unchanged from any Nikon camera. And that's basically true from Nikons, which are DSLRs, or Nikons that are mirrorless, like the Z series. the Z7, Z6 series of cameras, the menus are unchanged. So people that are actually going from a traditional Nikon DSLR system and the menu system has been in place for years will find a very, very similar menu system in here. Obviously, there are a few changes because obviously mirrorless technology is slightly different, but by and large, everything just makes sense if you're used to a Nikon system. But to be perfectly honest, with a camera like the Zfc, I think once you have all your initial setup done, you're very rarely going to be changing things too much in those menu systems. Everything will probably be done on top here or on the information menu at the back, or the quick access menu at the back. So as many of you know, Nikon don't really have a premium compact camera available in the market in the same way that Fujifilm have an X100V or Leica have a Q2, for example. This is very much an interchangeable lens system. However, the size would be, I would say, very comparable to those other cameras. With that, even though you do get the form factor of something very small and very carryable, you do still have the option to change lenses. So if you want to kind of keep it kind of small and compact, much like this one, for example, and mount, let's say, a 28mm lens onto it, you can do that, but equally you can have the flexibility of a zoom as well. I think in terms of build quality, Nikon have done a great job in terms of balancing build quality and size in terms of the materials that they've used to actually make this camera. Nikon know that most people are not going to be battering this camera in the same way that a pro level photographer would. So you can imagine a pro photographer is constantly putting stuff down, picking them up, changing lenses very quickly. The life that this camera is likely going to lead is not going to be the same as that. People are choosing this camera aside from many of its features, also because of its aesthetics, which means that people will probably look after this camera a lot more, be a lot more careful with it, in which case it means that it doesn't need to be built out of solid metal. And if it was built out of solid metal, it would be a lot heavier, which would mean that people would not want to take it out with them. I think the size, the weight, and where Nikon have chosen to actually make this camera out of more premium materials, I think is pretty much perfect. So what do I love about this camera? Well, I love the way it looks. I own a Nikon FM3A and I love the way the camera looks. So I think to have a mirrorless digital body that looks like this, I think is fantastic. I absolutely love the ISO dial at the top. I love the fact that I can actually change that dial and know which way to turn it, even as I'm peering through the viewfinder. So in case the light is beginning to go down as it is today, I can very easily just change the ISO very, very quickly without having to access a menu, and that is great. And thirdly, my other favorite thing about this camera is the usable JPEGs. I think for this type of camera, I think that's absolutely perfect. I think a lot of people will want to maybe tweak a little bit the output of the JPEG, which is totally possible in this camera. But I love the fact that you have an option to create a look that you like straight out of the camera without having to worry about raw images. The thing is, not everyone wants raw images. Some people just want nice pictures straight out of the camera. And this one gives you that option, and it gives you a lot more than just one option. You have tons of JPEG modes to choose from.